Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Listen with Vobes. I'm Richard Vobes. Sorry about the slight delay today. I think we're on time. Another reading from London Belongs to Me by Norman Collins. I hope you're all going to enjoy that. Excuse me. I may fall asleep halfway through it because I was filming very early this morning with the lovely Julia and didn't get much sleep last night because I was sleeping in the van. But anyway, all will be revealed. I may have to dash to the door because I've got an important delivery coming, a couple of shelf units for the new studio. So it could arrive between 3:30 and 6:15, so it says. So I may, just whiz out and open the door if I hear the knock. So hopefully I will. I might just put the door slightly ajar so I can make sure I hear it. There's two of them coming, so I want to make sure we've got all that. Anyway, hello to the lovely Julia, to Turbo Stream, to Audrey Forbes, to Steve G, to Dave Vad, Justine Jones, who says, survived my evening at the pub. Oh, fantastic. They had blankets and hot water bottles. How thoughtful is that? Anything to get you in to spend money, and people do need to spend their money in the shops and businesses that have been locked down and been unable to trade. I absolutely perfectly agree with all of that. Sensible Paul, good afternoon to you. He says, just finished doing the housework, time to sit and listen. Good for you, young fella, my lad. Zoom Coco, good afternoon. Anne H, who has her tea and is ready. Philip Hammond and Mary, nice to see you. Cooper68, Sean James Cameron, who's in the allotment today. Jen Coley has tea and chocolate wafers. My goodness. And Turbo Street. Oh, yeah, I've read that. But you don't have to get into some capers. She certainly does. And James Poulton, many thanks for your email. Thank you for your very kind donation, James. It's very much appreciated. You're a good egg. And a couple of shelves, you nits. What? A couple of shells, you nits. Yes. And listening while walking. I don't know what walking is, but if you've ever walked, then you're a better man than I am, Gungadin. Listening while working, says Mark Burgess. Very nice to have you here. It's 4 o'clock here in the UK. We will crack on. We are on chapter 47, ladies and gentlemen. It's such a great book. I know he wrote several books, but I wish he wrote more. And more like this, because I could read him till the cows come home. Oh, look, there they are. Coming in then, sit down. Poor little moo cows. Dudley Sawyer, hi everyone. Returned to the gym this morning. Bit of a shock to the system. I bet you probably need to sit down. Probably all of a quiver. Anyway, here we go. Piccadilly Circus may be the centre of London, and some people, enthusiastic provincials mostly, have called it the centre of the world. But you only have to go about a bit to see that even the first claim is dubious. Take the Marble Arch, for instance. The crowds at Marble Arch actually stop where they are, whereas Piccadilly Circus, everyone is always on the way to somewhere else. Choose any fine summer evening, and at the Marble Arch you will find a crowd of several hundred people standing about, greedily savouring the simple but tremendous pleasure of merely being there. It's a good spot. As dusk falls, the park in the background becomes vast and mysterious, and the gas lamps that light your way along the main paths dwindle into the distance like lanterns in Illyria, wherever that is. Illyria? Illyria. I don't know how you pronounce that. Illyria. Anyway. Let's not get hung up, but wherever it is. But somehow or other, it remains London, with the buses that cruise up Park Lane twinkling through the railings, and the air filled with roar and rustle of innumerable wheels. Yes, it's London all right, but it's also somewhere right outside it, sufficiently far out for you to be able to look up into the sky as the dusk deepens and see the gigantic upturned bowl of brightness that the West End has erected above itself. You can, in fact, stand at the Marble Arch and be just wherever you want to be in London or in the country. That's the magic of the place. Or rather, that's how it was in 1939. But the magic wasn't working for Mr. Josser because he didn't want to be there at all. He was standing miserably in the forefront of a group of about a dozen people trying to derive some comfort from the reflection that no one was to know what the prophet on the folding pulpit was. He didn't want to be there at all. He was standing miserably in the forefront of a group of about a dozen people, trying to derive some comfort from the reflection that no one was to know that the prophet on the folding pulpit was his brother-in-law. There was no real cause for anxiety, however. Uncle Henry was conspicuous only to Mr. Josser. Indeed, in all London, there was probably no place where he would have been less conspicuous, for there were other Uncle Henrys all round him, just beside his elbow, so close that two messages became mingled. Hang on, I'm sorry, slightly confused here. For there were other Uncle Henrys all around him. Just beside his elbow, so close that the two messages sometimes became mingled, was a Kensitite Uncle Henry preaching the straight Bible and no truck with Rome. A little further on was a bimetallist Uncle Henry reforming the currency. Then came a historical Uncle Henry who proved with bewildering satisfaction that everything important in the world happens in years that are multiples of 13 or 29. But as a draw, he was a failure compared with a young cousin Henry of the British Union of Fascists, who kept telling his listeners to carry a dagger in their belts and to keep a weather eye on Palestine. Further on was another popular draw, a black Uncle Henry with a grievance against doctors. And in between came an anti-vivisectionist Uncle Henry, trying to whip up his audience of one man into a frenzy by brandishing a picture of a chloroformed cat. Then, further on still, came Comrade Henry of the Communist Party Henry. The Comrade Henry of the Communist Party, exposing an ingenious plot on the part of the employers to attack Russia by getting the government to declare war on Germany. And last of all was Old Father Henry, dressed up in the loose black and white robes of the Dominican order, recounting the miracle of Lourdes. Indeed, it would have seemed at first glance as though even the most exacting listener could have found exactly what he wanted simply by strolling on until he came to others of his own persuasion. But that wasn't the way things worked. On the contrary, all the audiences were hostile. Communists gathered around the fascist, and fascists gathered in front of the communist. A sworn adherent to gold struck himself under the nose of the bimetallist, and the mere mention of Lourdes brought atheists, agnostics, rationalists, and freethinkers crashing round the Dominican. Uncle Henry's own group was made up of a man of steady-going Uncle Henry's own group was made up to a man of steady-going Primrose Leaguers who supported Mr. Chamberlain. The day had been hot, sweltering hot. It had still been hot when Uncle Henry had climbed up into his little pulpit. Mr. Josser had seen the beads of sweat standing out on his forehead as he was speaking. But now, with the evening, it had grown suddenly colder. Mr. Josser found himself shivering. A wind sprang up, shaking the branches overhead, and a few drops of rain fell, isolated heavy drops that suggested more. Immediately the crowd, timid as kittens at the approach of water, divided up into small groups and huddled themselves at the foot of the trees, or made their way in crocodile streams to the bus stops or the underground. Uncle Henry finally folded up his notes and came down from the pulpit in the manner of an admiral quitting the bridge after a successful engagement. "I reckon that got under their skins," he said, rubbing his hands together. "That'll make 'em think." "Good," said Mr. Josser, his teeth chattering. "Shall we get this thing down now?" He pointed at the folding pulpit as he spoke and began fingering the patent catches. Those 2 hours had been unpleasantly chilling, simply standing there, and now, with the rain threatening at any moment to become a downpour, he wanted to be getting home. It was different for Uncle Henry, who had taken out his coloured handkerchief and was wiping off the perspiration that was still forming on his forehead. "What we need," he said, "is hundreds of these meetings up and down the country. Protests, mass demonstration, telegrams to MPs. "Yeah, just so," Mr. Josser answered. He had just found the secret of the patent catch, which was holding the pulpit together. It really needed 2 people to work at it, but Mr. Josser didn't want to bother Uncle Henry at that moment. That was how it was that the whole contraption suddenly came crashing down to the ground without warning. It was a multi-jointed affair, and it took them some time, both of them, some time to get it up again and shut it properly. Even then, they were left with a pile of pamphlets, the literature, as Uncle Henry called it. There were 2 large batches, one entitled "The Way to War," and the other "What Price Munich?" And they were becoming sodden. Uncle Henry went across and folded his Evening Standard over them. As he did so, Mr. Josser could not help noticing that the headlines of the paper were as alarmist as Uncle Henry. They announced that Queen Wilhelmina and King Leopold, as safe as 2 neutrals can be, were offering to mediate in the impending quarrel between giants. Uncle Henry looked up suddenly. "You all right?" he asked. Me? "For literature, I mean," Uncle Henry explained. "Let me know as soon as you want some more. I'm having another edition printed." "Oh, yeah, well, I'll let you know," Mr. Josser promised. He felt uncomfortable and deceitful as he said it. There was a whole heap still behind the couch in Dulcimer Street. Or there were, if Mrs. Josser hadn't moved them. She'd been threatening to throw them away if Mr. Josser didn't do something. "Well, give me a hand then," Uncle Henry said abruptly. He slung his bundle of pamphlets over his shoulder, and Mr. Josser took the pulpit. They didn't have far to go because Uncle Henry's green bicycle was chained against the railings, and there was a trailer attached to it. The trailer had been Uncle Henry's own invention. A picture of it, with Uncle Henry up, had appeared in Cycling. Into the trailer went 2 bundles with the folding pulpit fitted across the top. Then Uncle Henry squatted down beside it and proceeded to lash up the contraption with straps. "See you at Parliament Hill on Sunday," he said. 11 o'clock sharp." Mr. Josser nodded. "I'll be there," he said. Uncle Henry came closer. "And keep next Thursday free," he said, confidentially. I may be taking the Prince of taking the Prince of Wales. I may be taking the Prince of Wales baths. They had reached Stanhope Gate by now, and Uncle Henry climbed into the saddle. As Mr. Josser, with coat turned up, stood watching him, he found that he rather envied the man. He seemed so vigorous, so independent, so inexhaustible. Even now, as he pedalled off with his trailer rattling after him across Park Lane and into Mayfair, he was not relaxing. He was calling out, "Get rid of Chamberlain! Get rid of Chamberlain and prepare for war!" in that high-pitched, slightly mad-sounding voice of his. Mr. Josser stood looking after him until the words, like the tail lamp of the trailer, had grown fainter and still fainter in the darkness, and finally were lost amidst the rest of London. Chapter 48. We went through that quite swiftly, didn't we? Sorry about the hiccups. I'm getting a cold draft with the door open, but I don't want to miss my my delivery. Chapter 48. It was September the 1st. September the 1st, 1939. A lot was happening. Queen Wilhelmina and King Leopold's offer of mediation had been rejected. Not that there was anything very remarkable in that. Indeed, looking back on it afterwards, it's doubtful if either of them really expected it to be accepted, because, taken all in all, it had been European Rejection Week. Similar snubs had just been administered to His Holiness and President Roosevelt. In short, the Nazis weren't having any, and, in the circumstances, it seemed pretty sporting and public-spirited of Mussolini, of all people, to propose a conference. But by then, patience had worn a bit thin all round, and Whitehall wasn't having any of it either. It was, of course, nice to know that we were still a friend. We still had a friend in Mussolini, but with Herr Foster, a Nazi, already installed in Danzig as a head of state, and Hitler as rude as he had been to Sir Neville Henderson, it was plain that no good would come of any more parley. Or palaver, any more palaver, I beg your pardon. That was why, just 4 hours after the Third Reich began its blitzkrieg on Poland, the London County Council was busy bundling the first parties of children out of the metropolis for their long holiday in the country. It nearly broke Connie's heart to think about those poor kids, and it upset her a bit on her own account as well. The government would hardly go to all that trouble and expense, special trains and reception committees and what not, like a glorified Cook's tour, unless they expected something. And if the balloon really went up, what was to become of Connie, poor thing, and only Mr. Puddy in between her and Marshal Goering's Luftwaffe? The mere thought of it was enough to bring on that sinking feeling. But it was the school children that really scared her, and their poor dear mothers. Just think of it. One day a whole quiverful of little blue-eyed darlings with lisps, and on the next just a nursery of empty cots and all unplayed with... Sorry, I'm not reading very well today. And on the next just a nursery of empty cots and unplayed with toys. She wondered how many women could stand it. There'd be suicides if she knew anything about it. Nice, motherly women popping their heads into gas ovens just because they couldn't bear the pain of separation. And little orphaned children crying under haystacks or trying to walk back to London in their shoes that were worn through to the tiny little feet inside them. Connie took out her handkerchief and had a good cry over it. She'd always been that way about cruelty to children. And this was funny, because she didn't particularly like children when she was with them, but in imagination they were heavenly little creatures, golden-haired ones especially. They brought out the best in her. Not that there was anything unusual in that. She was always having the best brought out. Holiday makers drowned while bathing, brides killed in motor smashes, seabirds with oil on their wings, fathers of families getting caught up in machinery, cats marooned on church steeples. She rarely got through the daily paper completely dry-eyed. As all these dreadful things were happening, and as these poor little innocents, all weeping and struggling to get back to their mothers, were going to be sent away, she decided that she may as well go along to Waterloo to see something of it. She'd even stand herself a platform ticket, if that would help. It wasn't every day that there was drama like that going on just round the corner. She got to the station at about 10:30. At first it was difficult to get in because there was so much happening. But she managed it all right in the end, even though it did mean having a few words over her shoulder with a policeman. Once inside, what a scene it was. Not a bit as she imagined, mind you. No screaming, no hysteria, no panic. Just rows and rows of children, each with a gas mask, a parcel containing rations and sponge bag, and a label to prove that the child really was itself and not a totally different child from some other school. It was all orderly, efficient, disciplined, as though the London County Council had been in the business of children's crusades for years. The teachers who were looking after these enormous families might have been in charge of a mass visit to the zoo. They merely had about them the look of depressed watchfulness, which is common to all adults accompanying school outings. The children themselves were blithe, excited, and ready for anything. For a moment, Connie was almost disappointed. It looked as though she had misread the part. Then the artist in her came to the top again, and she spotted that really it was worse, much worse this way. It meant that the children were simply so many little dumb animals being herded into trucks like cattle without realising what was happening. That brought a lump back into her throat all right, and made her eyes misty. When an infant school of toddlers trotted out of the yard, it was too much for her. She took out her handkerchief and cried. "You're an old fool, Connie," she told herself. "That's what you are, an old fool. If you can't stand it, you shouldn't have come." But she knew that such advice, even from herself, was useless. This was something that she wouldn't have missed for the worlds. She hadn't properly recovered when she was moved out of the way, quite rudely, by a ticket inspector who seemed to have been put in charge of all the mothers and babies. Obviously a family man himself, he was followed by a long column of large, dejected women with small, wrapped-up babies. Connie looked away. Between Connie and her sex there was no spare sympathy. It was just the children without mothers who got her every time. There was one little girl in particular. She wasn't even an especially pretty child, just one more junior evacuee standing out a little in the line. She had a band across her front teeth and wore glasses with a length of cotton wound around the bridge. But she just stood there. She was hugging a teddy bear and talking to it. The sight quite bowled Connie over. She wondered what the teacher would say if someone, a stranger, started kissing one of her pupils. Then a happy idea came to her. She couldn't afford it, but what did it matter? If there really was going to be a war, money wouldn't be worth anything, so why not spend now while there was still a chance? Crossing over to the sweet stall, she bought a Mars bar. The little girl with the teddy bear was so surprised that she didn't even say thank you. But Connie scarcely noticed that, because there was a big new sensation close at hand. A press photographer was taking pictures of the children, and the children were bunching themselves together into the group. Connie didn't stand a chance herself when a well-dressed, determined-looking woman, obviously the headmistress, came striding up to establish order and get into the photograph herself. Connie was elbowed right back, in fact, and simply had to stand looking on. The sadness of it all was affecting her again, and she pulled out her handkerchief. Some of the children had surreptitiously opened their parcels and started lunch. Little bits were dropping everywhere. "I'd like to have Hitler here," she reflected gloatingly. "I'd like to have him to myself for 5 minutes. I'd like to make him go down on his knees and clear up after them." She was disturbed in her reverie by a hand which was placed on her forearm. It was a timid, hesitating pressure, quite unlike the way the policeman grabs hold of you. She turned and saw that there was an old gentleman standing beside her. And such a nice old gentleman, white crinkly hair under the black hat and a loose bow tie, quite the elderly clubman, in fact, with a rolled-up umbrella hanging over his arm and a whole armyful of shiny picture papers. He'd got a suitcase with his initials on the ground beside him, and for some reason or other he was holding out a £1 note towards Connie. "Bless them," he said, rather huskily, not even looking at Connie, but staring straight in front at the children. "It's terrible to have it happening, but they'll be safe, and that's all that matters. I saw you giving them something just now. See what you can do with this." He thrust the £1 note into her hand, and without waiting for an answer, he moved off. For a moment, it fairly stumped Connie, getting a whole quid to spend like that. But she liked the idea of going right up and down the long lines of children, distributing chocolate and buns and monkey nuts like some perishing Lady Bountiful. She went straight back to the sweet stall where she bought the first Mars bar, thinking what a stir her new order was going to make. There was quite a crowd already gathered there, however, and she had to wait a while a lot of fiddling of small stuff was attended to. It was while she was waiting that she saw a tiny incident that altered everything. A small boy in the party nearest to her started eating an orange before he'd finished the sandwich that he'd got in his hand, and the master in charge spotted him. He was a rough, brutal type of man, the master, quite the reverse of the old gentleman, and he gave 2 little hoots on his whistle that he'd been carrying in his pocket. "Moordyke Road Senior Boys," he said in a harsh, penetrating voice. "Listen to me. There's eating going on again. Stop it. I don't want you all to be sick on the train." Well, that was that. Who would want a whole lot of... Well, that was that. Who would want a whole lot of children being sick all over the upholstery, particularly if you had to travel with them? Not Connie. She saw now that it wouldn't be fair on the teachers to give as much as 1 piece of chocolate away. It was just one of those things. She looked round for the old gentleman, but he'd gone. There was nothing she could do about it. She hadn't asked for it. It had been a gift. She stood there, pondering. Then, folding up the £1 note very small, she thrust it deep into her handbag and shot straight out of the station, No loitering. If this was stealing, she'd been wasting her time all these years. It was the next day that she had her big surprise. In the Daily Mirror front page, there was a picture of the children and a close-up of herself giving the little girl with the teddy bear a Mars bar. It made her go all gooseflesh from excitement. She hoped the old gentleman would see it too, because, in a way, it seemed to prove things. Then she read the caption, and she wasn't so pleased. It was professionally damaging, she reckoned. There might even be a libel action in it. Granny gives her mite, was the caption. Was what the caption said. Granny gives her mite. There was one further little piece of excitement when she got back. The men had come to measure for the air raid shelter. The air raid shelter had been Mr. Squale's idea. Ever since Mrs. Jan Bill's premature retreat from the ruins of London, he'd been worried about Mrs. Vizard's safety. The house was old, he could not help remembering. It did need only one good push to send the whole stucco terrace shuddering to the ground, and if his intended was going to stay in the danger zone, he wanted somewhere below ground for her, somewhere snug where he could creep in and sit beside her so that she wouldn't be afraid. Chapter 49. Just pause there for a moment. 4:30. Have a glug of water. Oh. Sorry about the slight hiccups in today's reading. It's because I didn't have much sleep and we were out early filming today. So, and also it's quite cold in here because I've got the door open because I don't want to miss the what's the name coming. Chapter 49. It's the next day now. Evening on September the 2nd. Tomorrow will bring what tomorrow will bring. At that moment, tomorrow is just like any other day, except for the fact that the Prime Minister is going to speak. The atmosphere is tense, but there are no foregone conclusions. Let's get away from Dulcimer Street for a moment. Things are going on elsewhere as well. Liners are drawing in at the big ports, aeroplanes are arriving at Croydon, and if you feel like it, you can walk into any railway ticket office and book straight through to Berlin. Take a look at Harwich, always a good stepping-off point. At Parkstone Quarry, at Parkstone Quay, lies the night boat for Hook. Overhead in the thickening dusk, seagulls wind backwards and forwards in circles as though on strings like children's kites. Despite the rows of suspended lamps, which swing a little in the breeze that comes straight from the North Sea, the whole place looks bleak, desolate, and a little unfriendly, as dockyards always look at night. Oyster crates are piled along the first-class waiting room. On the other side of the harbour, the Royal Naval side, the guards have been doubled up and all the destroyers have got steam up. But it's too dark to see any of that. Everything that's in sight is as normal as the seagulls. The 8 o'clock train from Liverpool Street draws in, the pink table lamps in the Pullman cars momentarily lending a touch of almost drawing-room comfort to the scene. Porters, the queer half-breed race, part railway servant, part sea dog, that inhabit every maritime terminus, come forward from a small room that smells of paraffin and cooking. There is new life in the refreshment buffet, where the young ladies, wiping their damp red hands on their black dresses, saunter along to take up their positions behind the bar. In the customs sheds, the clerks arrange their cardboard boxes of coloured crayons and hang out their notices about explosives and hashish. two dim little men, special officers from Scotland Yard, hang about in the doorway. Then the passengers come streaming in. They're a quiet, heavy lot, with very few women among them, mostly businessmen with large briefcases elaborately strapped and buckled. They have about them the air of extreme importance, which is their birthright, which is the birthright of commercial foreigners. They stand up in their when they stand up in front of their suitcases to allow the customs men to carefully go through their pyjamas, their toilet case, their change of underwear, a row of pink necks bulge out over their hard white collars. Then, innocent of concealed firearms, they raise their fury velars politely, show their passports, which are examined as casually as though they were train tickets, and pass through to the boat for a quick drink before sailing. A small, round man at the far end takes a little longer than the others. Two of the customs men are bending low over his bag, and one of the special officers from Scotland Yard approaches hopefully. But it's nothing, only the top of Dr. Haffle's hair cream bottle that has come off. He borrows a duster to mop up his nice silk dressing gown, and then he too hurries through to the waiting room. In fact, the waiting boat. His thesis on the leader principle in democratic government has been accepted, and if the present trouble blows over, it will be published in London as well as Leipzig. During the 3 years that he's been in London, he's discovered many things about the English. First is their ignorance. Keeping themselves to themselves is the highest virtue. In consequence, the entire island race knows nothing of what is happening elsewhere, and no one seems to care very much. Stupidity, coupled with comfort, has produced a breed that is impervious to anxiety. They sleep at night secure in the arms of the navy that no one ever sees, supported by an empire that no one ever mentions. Puzzling, but to a philosopher like Dr. Hapfel, also pathetic. There is a lot in England that the sentimentalists in him would like to see preserved, remodelled, of course, brought up to date, and gleich, I don't know what that is, gleichgeschelt, some German word, I don't know, it sounds grim, but preserved. But as things are, there will be little, very little left. Nothing, in fact, left of the England that he has known. Even the pleasant little things, like the young lady with the high colouring and lace bodice in the newsagents at the corner of the Euston Road. She'll be swept away with Mr. Chamberlain and the Archbishop of Canterbury and Mr. Montague Norman and the Jews of the City of London. Mr. Hapfel stumbles as he mounts the gangway, and someone, a stranger standing on the quayside, helps to steady him. "Lift him up," he says. "It's only for life." Only for life. It is precisely this attitude that Dr. Hapfel has tried to explain in his thesis, an attitude compounded of cynicism and insensitiveness and impudence. It's the same attitude that has allowed a daily paper this morning, apparently without threat of police action, to publish a cartoon of the Führer, his Führer, dressed up in the costume of Charlie Chaplin. There must, Dr. Hapfel decides, as he tries to fit himself into his little cabin, be more to it than either Herr Ribbentrop or the Link have yet to discover. Perhaps English humour really is a sublimitation of the death urge, the suicide impulse. Perhaps Mr. Chamberlain actually wants to impale himself. Perhaps he is certifiable. Undoing his sponge bag, Dr. Haffel, PhD, removes his toothbrush and his odal and proceeds to brush his teeth. The boat has just left, and the 8 o'clock train for Liverpool Street is being pushed away into a siding. The porters have shut themselves away in their paraffin closet. The young ladies in the buffet have turned out the light and have left the washing up until tomorrow. The customs men have disappeared to wherever customs men disappear to between departures, and the special officers from Scotland Yard have gone to a commercial hotel for the night. Only the seagulls are still there. The boat, with Dr. Hapfel on board, is now no more than a smudge of lights on the horizon. Take a good look at it. It is the last gleam of brightness that will be seen in the North Sea for quite some time. There isn't going to be a boat train tomorrow because there won't be any boat. By then, it will be at war. It will be war, and England really will be keeping herself to herself. And now, at 20 to 5, we go to Book 4, and it's chapter 50. But Book 4 is called Rex versus Percy Boone. And I am tempted to save this for tomorrow, purely because it starts with the trial, which is an important thing, and it would be good perhaps to not start it because it's great. It is great. And it might be silly to wreck it, really. I could just read this one bit. I could just get us into this one bit. I'll read this one bit so that we've got somewhere to go tomorrow, okay? And then we'll stop. It's only a short bit. Don't know what that was. Book 4, Rex versus Percy Boone, chapter 50. A lot more had been happening. On the very day when war had been declared, within half an hour of the declaration, in fact, the air raid sirens had sounded, and Londoners had been introduced to their new signature tune. It was, as it turned out, only a false alarm. No air raid followed. But on that, which is all true, by the way, that really did happen, but on that tremendous Sunday, everybody was a bit on edge, including the aircraft spotters. In consequence, the coastal batteries were opening up on anything in sight, even on our own planes. Not that people were jumpy without reason. It was war, all right. Out in the September Sea off Ireland, the liner, Athena, packed as full of children as a day nursery, was settling down in the water with her keel blown away by a torpedo, and the U-boat that had fired it was standing by on the surface shelling the survivors. Again, true. There was something fateful and symbolic about the whole affair. It was as though the uneasy quarter century since 1914 had come round full circle, and von Tirpitz was risen from his grave to redirect operations. It was the same on the continent. The Great War had come again, only this time it was east and not west that the Germans were striking. Belgium was safe in its neutrality, but Poland, sliced like a ham, had been made into a neat sandwich, which Germany and the USSR squeezing it tighter every day. People, remembering Finland, talked about the Russians being as bad as the Nazis. It certainly didn't look good with the Communist Party standing out against the war, and wise men reminded the world that it is always easier to start a war than to end one. And so it went on. Policemen wore tin helmets, and fire pumps were attached as trailers to the back of taxis. Peace news doubled its circulation, and shoppers carried their gas masks in their baskets. Income tax was 7 and 6pence, and the National Register was taken. Sandbags were piled in doorways, and the barrage balloons floated overhead like silver sheep. There was a blackout all over Britain, and Winston was back at the Admiralty. And all the time, the law, quiet, methodical, and as undistracted as ever, had been proceeding with its briefs and dispositions, its summons to juries, and its calendar of trials. Everything was now ready for the case of Rex versus Percy Aloysius Boone. And we will find out what happens in that tomorrow. Wow, how about that? War has started. It's absolutely amazing. Every time I read this book, this is the third time, you see just different things in it. And of course, I'm reading it aloud this time, which is so different than reading it quietly to oneself. You read it aloud, and you're trying to interpret the words and make it make sense as well. So it's absolutely crazy. Let's have a look at some of your comments. My cat likes Mars. Mars, it says they're big in as they are big in pet food. Right. Oh, okay. What? Oh, Mars make pet food. Okay. You don't feed Mars bars to your cats. I get it. Guinness is good for you. The other slogan they say was Mars. I'm late, says Michael White. I've probably missed all the tea and cake. I'm afraid so. I gobbled up most of it. Edward Moulding says, see you tomorrow. Oh, sorry. Save some for tomorrow. Some to look forward to. Oh, there is plenty. Oh, my goodness. You're not going to leave us hanging, says Anne H. I'm afraid that is it. Oh, yes, please do carry on, says Lee Lawson. We've just come to that point now where tomorrow we'll get into the case, and it's important that we have Flo. She's a nice girl, and she cleans all the chairs and everything. Turbo says, the slogan Mars a Day helps you rest, work and play was devised by Murray Walker of F1 fame. He worked in advertising before F1. Yes, I think I've heard that story, actually. Gleich Chalet, I can't pronounce that. Thank you, Dave. Ivad. The process of successfully establishing a system of totalitarianism. Yeah, I think it's also known as COVID, isn't it? Have you ever had a deep-fried Mars bar? No, I've never had one of those. Oswald Mosley held meetings on the seafront in Worthing during the 30s, says Dudley Sawyer. Blimey. The National Register is very useful for family historians now. I don't know about the National Register. So is that like the Doomsday Book of the War, that they made a register, or like the census? Is that what it's sort of special one-off census type thing? Great read, thank you very much. Great book. Really don't want to miss an episode, says Turbo Stream. It's a great book, Sense of Impending Doom. Yeah, great stuff. Looking forward to tomorrow. Lovely reading, thank you. Can't wait for tomorrow. Good evening all. Hope you have sun tomorrow. There we go. Marvellous. Thank you so much. Sorry it's a slightly shortened one, but as you can see, I think it's important to, as I say, just have that flow in it, because I think once we get into the proceedings, again, it is like being in the courtroom. It's one of those where the courtroom and all the nuances, you just don't want to miss the seriousness, but also the humour that Norman Collins puts in. It is it's remarkable talent, I think, to be able to have a serious thing that you actually really care about the characters, but at the same time there is this underlining wry sense of humour and a look at the way he looks at us, and he's looking at himself. I think he's looking at the English persona, holding up a mirror, and I think while it must have been interesting at the time, I think it's more fascinating now as a snapshot of what the British were like, and particularly the English at that time, because it was written in 1945, and whilst things are somewhat, heightened as you do when you write, I think that all that little sort of petty detail that he puts in, that is just so, that makes it all so real, and almost to the point of being too much petty detail, but not quite. Buying the bus tickets and the clock striking and all this sort of stuff that you don't think about. I love it, and I love his turn of phrase. But anyway, there we are. More like a census, and formed the basis of the NHS. Oh, did it? How fascinating. There we are, the National Register. Brilliant. All right. Well, I'll see you tomorrow. Take care. Have a lovely evening. There'll be a Vogue show this evening. And then who knows what after that? Sleep, I should hope. Anyway, take care. Thanks for watching. And I will catch up with you tomorrow. All the best. Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.